Many of us have very low interoception, this idea of knowing what's going on inside of us, knowing our urges, our feelings, our hormones, our cravings, our digestion, our respiratory rate, and our heart rate. Many of us are unaware. We know the political activities of 3 different countries. We know the real-time coronavirus numbers all around the world, but we don't have an idea of what's going on with our own heart. On this week's show, we'll chat about heart rate variability. It's a recurring theme on the show. It's a little bit of a nerdy, difficult one to unravel, but once you understand how it works, it's a really great piece of quantified self-knowledge to add to your toolkit. Here's how it works here. If you go to the gym and you put your hands on a heart rate monitor, or you wear a chest strap, and it tells you that your heart rate's beating, let's say 120 beats a minute, 140 beats per minute if you're jogging or something like this. This is an average beats per minute. The device is just rounding up or down. It's averaging in a minute. And they're pretty accurate, but again, it's an average. And an average is not exact. The reality is your beat-to-beat variability in a healthy individual is quite pronounced. And what that means is rather than a healthy heart going boom, 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 a healthy heart might go boom, 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 boom. Now I'm exaggerating a little to show you a point, but the idea is that a healthy heart is actually very agile and very inconsistent. It's not like a locomotive going down the train tracks. It's like a scared cat running through an open field, zigging and zagging and zigging and zagging. And that's what we like, to have a heart rate, a nervous system. It's an indication of your nervous system, of course, that is highly responsive, not reactive, but responsive to your environment. And it's an indicator of low stress, an indicator of exceptional health. And we'd like to promote higher heart rate variability, a greater agility, a greater range between our beat-to-beat variation. And you can measure this now with your phone at home, in bed with a cheap app, and it works pretty well to give you a good idea about how you're doing with your stress response. Stress levels, of course, are at an all-time high all around the world. Lots of unknowns, lots of questioning about what the world's going to look like and how things are going to play out, and we don't really know how things are going to go. But what we do know is that for sure, we can't control the outer world until we control our inner world, or at least try to control our inner world. And you can't even attempt to control your inner world till you understand what's going on. We've talked a lot on the show about fasting blood glucose, about body fat, about parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, about using breathing as a training tool. Heart rate variability is another tool that I'd encourage you to take a look at. And I wasn't so bullish on it before because the sensor technology was kind of a gating factor, but these days you can do it just with your phone. If you're new here, it's the Lucas Rockwood Show. On this podcast, I go out into the world of health and wellness and mind-body research, and I bring PhDs, and I bring medical doctors and yoga teachers and anyone doing interesting things in the field, and I try to bring their best work to you to hopefully give you new ideas on how to live a more inspired life. My guest on this week's show is a pioneer in HRV and does a lot of work developing apps for athletes as well as everyday people, recurring guest, and I think you'll find it very useful. If you like this show, the way to show your support is to, number one, share the show on social and tag me, it's at Lucas Rockwood, and leave a rating and review. If you're in your podcasting app, whatever you're using, just scroll down, you can leave a rating and review. That just helps other people to find the show. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. So hello and welcome everyone. Today's show is called Heart Rate Variability Simplified. My guest today is Marco Altini. He's a recurring guest. He was on the show. I just checked. It was about 3.5 years ago, so time has gone by quickly. Marco's a data scientist, a programmer. He has a PhD in machine learning, and he's been doing lots and lots of work on HRV for a long time, since about 2012. There's a lot of different HRV projects and HRV apps. HRV4, the number 4, HRV4training.com, I believe is his most important project, but we'll get into that in a moment. And while you're listening, you can check that out. Marco, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So just so I make sure, since our last conversation, is HRV4training.com, is that still your main project that you're working on?
Yeah, correct. That's the main product we offer.
So our listeners are interested in health and wellness and mind-body fitness and biofeedback. You know, I feel like every couple of years something comes in, people get really excited, and then it goes away. Something comes in and it goes away, whether it's, Headspace meditation app, or whether it's, tracking your brain waves for deeper sleep, or beats that are played behind music to help people fall asleep. But HRV's kind of always been there for a lot of years. It's always been it's not so popular. People don't understand it. They get the math part of it really gets them confused, but there's a whole lot that people can learn from it. But the nerdy math part of it really gets people a little bit lost, the data crunching. So for let's say we have a listener here who's an amateur athlete, like they like to do endurance runs or obstacle races or something like that. And we have somebody who's just a high stress worker. With those two use cases, both of whom make up listeners of the show, how might they think about heart rate variability in terms of like what can I actually learn about myself if I start using this technology?
As a matter of fact, it's pretty much the same approach that you would use. So, you mentioned quite a few, things that people could try to use in general, to improve their health or performance. But when we talk about HRV, let's say the aspect that we've covered the most in the past few years, that where we really try to help people, benefit from the technology, is not really what you'd call, some sort of hack or intervention, but it's really just about measuring these parameters so that you can better understand your response to stress. And, again, stress comes from all sorts of factors, from training to lifestyle, and, depending on what's our interest or what we do or what we are busy with in our lives, there can be different stressors for each one of us, but these stressors will have an impact on our physiology. It will have an impact on our physiology and, of course, on our ability to handle additional stress, right? Because our ability to handle stress our capacity is limited. So it does make sense, to try to understand what's the stress level on our body, if in a certain period we are more stressed than our normal, right? And what changes could we make in that case to try to get back on track. So the way we approach the technology first is always this sort of awareness angle, right? So you take your measurement and you understand, what's your normal physiological level, and that allows you to understand better when, there is more stress and your body is more stressed than your normal, because again, everything is always in relation to yourself. And from that timing point, you can, make small adjustments or simply try to balance things better. So even before, going into everything that is possible ways to improve things, I think the step zero is just to use the technology as a tool for awareness and to capture individual responses to stress. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. So for people listening, everyone listening at some point, probably in primary school or high school, they had a physical education teacher who had them check their heart rate, and they would put their fingers on their wrist and count for 10 seconds and multiply by 6, or they put a chest strap on and measured their heart rate, or they went to the gym and grabbed the handles on an elliptical machine, and maybe they're at the gym and the elliptical machine says their heart rate is 142 beats per minute, or they're resting in their science class and they calculated that their resting heart rate was 69 beats per minute or something like that. And what those, if I understand correctly, with that technology, a chest strap, a hand grip at a gym, even just checking yourself, what you're doing there is approximating an average beats per minute, and heart rate variability is more nuanced, correct? Can you help people understand the difference between an average heartbeat per minute and then what the insight that we get from heart rate variability?
Yeah, exactly. So, this starts from the fact that basically as your body tries to maintain, a state of balance or respond to different stressors, your nervous system adjusts heart rhythm, right? And this means that the time between different beats is modulated by how you respond to stress. So while your average heart rate, if there is a very strong stressor like exercise or, some some even very strong mental stressor, you probably notice yourself, your heart rate is higher, right? And that also means that at the same time, your variability is reduced. But when you are at rest, using just average heart rate is not as a sensitive marker of stress, because you need basically very strong stressors to see changes in resting heart rate, while heart rate variability is more sensitive to all other stressors, and that makes it a better marker of stress, especially measured at rest. And I would say this brings us to the most important point, maybe when you want to make use of this technology, which is when you should measure, because this is probably where much of the confusion starts, and people get all sorts of numbers out of this, HRV tracking devices or apps. As you were mentioning, right, it makes it a bit difficult sometimes to wrap your head around it and understand what these numbers mean, basically, which is actually rather simple, but it just needs to be done in a certain way, which means, first thing in the morning, that's when your body is rested, and that's when you're not affected by all other confounding factors as stressors, because again, you measure stress and the activity of the autonomic nervous system, and anything affects you, right? Even just light activity, or what you're eating, or if you had coffee, and those stressors are just transient stressors that will disappear in a few minutes or a bit longer. And what we care about is just measuring this baseline chronic stress, which is what will help you eventually making adjustments when there is more or less stress. And that is done, with this measurement first thing in the morning as soon as you wake up.
So here's the thing that I think is, with health, it can be really challenging, is some things are paradoxical. So, like, for example, in order to be healthy when you're eating, you often have to eat lots of dietary fat to burn fat. And that's really paradoxical, and it confuses people. With breathing, you actually have to breathe more slowly to absorb oxygen, which again is kind of paradoxical, and people get confused about this. And with heart rate variability, I think the stereotype, the belief is that your heart should be slow and steady and rhythmic, beat to beat to beat. But the reality is, if I understand correctly, a healthy heart should have a dynamic, irregular, highly variable pattern. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. So, the more variability normally, the better, or the less stress, at least for, relative to your normal.
So to reiterate, this idea of a healthy heart, if you asked, I think, 99 people on the street what they would describe a healthy heart, someone who's uneducated about heart rate, I think they would say that it was slow and steady, like a locomotive, like a train. But actually, what we're looking for is a really responsive heart, right? So you step out into the street, and a car comes, you inhale, and your heart races, and then you sit down at your desk in the office, and your heart, boom, boom, drops. And it's one of the biggest challenges, I think, with health is there's a lot of things that are completely counterintuitive. If you were to take your best logical guess, you would think, if I eat fat, I'll get fat. Not true, right? You'd think if I breathe fast, I'll get lots of oxygen. Not true. You would think if my heart's slow and steady, I'm super healthy. But no, it's actually a sign of disease. Okay, so last time we chatted, it was a few years ago, and things have changed. I've been totally underwhelmed by technology up until this year. I'm just seeing stuff with AI and filters and conferencing technology. I feel like there's been a really big breakthrough. When I first got into HRV, I was still using the same, essentially, well, I'm sure there's been some changes in terms of how the technology works, but I'm wearing the same chest strap that I was wearing when I used to go running when I was 19 years old, and I'm just curious, has phone sensor technology gotten better, cheaper, accessible? Have wearables improved things at all in terms of actual chipsets and sensors for your average person listening who doesn't have access to a sports lab or anything like that? Where are we at in terms of technology and accuracy with at-home devices?
So I think we made some progress in this past few years. In terms of phone technology, there is the technology that we have developed, which allows you to measure just using the iPhone or Android phones, and without external sensors, which we validated with respect to chest straps and also full ECGs, so medical devices in the lab. So it's the same accuracy for these measurements that you do in the morning, so short measurements, 1 or 2 minutes. So that's a way to do it. in terms of other sensors that you could use, the Apple Watch got better also in the past few years. So it is possible to do a measurement using the Apple Watch as well. Here, though, you need to, again, think about what we were talking before in terms of the context, the fact that you need to do it as soon as you wake up because you need to capture that moment in which you're not affected by other stressors. So you can do that with Apple Watch through the Breathe app that they have.
Okay.
So using that, basically, it allows you to take a measurement like you would do with another device, and then it pushes it to the health app. And then, for example, you can use the HRV for Training app, our system, to read that data point and then start building your baseline like you would do, with your camera measurements. So that's an alternative you have. I would say otherwise, the alternative to the morning measurement is also the full night measurement. That also counts, as something that you could do if you have a device that tracks during the night and is reliable. And in terms of those devices, normally we recommend the Oura Ring, which is also validated technology. So it allows you to measure HRV during the night. We read it from there, get the average of the night. And that's also representative, of course, of your physiological stress level as you sleep, and you're not affected by many other factors. So I would say, there's been improvements. Still, the options are quite limited, just a couple of devices that you can trust. And apart from, as you mentioned, the good old chest strap, which is not as easy to use, but always reliable.
Yeah, when I went on a regime measuring myself many years ago, and I really got frustrated with the chest strap. I got tons of chest straps. I got them all over the office. I got them at home. But you wake up in the morning and you just don't want to put the thing on. You don't want to get it wet. It's just like so the phone camera thing makes a huge difference in terms of the follow through. Which leads to my next question for people, and I think the early morning reading is a great suggestion. A lot of my listeners are familiar with checking fasting blood glucose. Also needs to be consistent, right? You need to do it in the morning.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing.
Yeah, so if you get in the habit, you can really get it. But unlike fasting blood glucose, where we can give general ranges that don't apply to everybody, but pretty good for a general population, HRV is very individual specific, right? You need to compare you to you, not so much you to me, right?
Exactly. So that's another point which is really important. And, sometimes people miss it because maybe, you take a device or something and you take a measurement and, your first thought is, what does this mean? Where does that put me with respect to others?
Yeah.
Or maybe you measure and compare with a friend and so things like that. And that's really of no use, I would say, for HRV, unless we want to, talk about comparing populations which are like extremely different, someone with chronic disease and someone that is, an Olympic athlete. But does that really, tell us anything that we didn't know already before measuring? So I think what matters here is really measuring at the individual level and then looking at changes over time with respect to your historical data. And, that sounds complicated, but it's actually very easy because the systems do it for you these days. Our app, for example, would start collecting data every day, and then it will show you in some easy to understand manner what's your score today with respect to your previous days, and if there is more or less stress, it will tell you. And that's always the most meaningful way to look at HRV data, because again, our absolute score will depend, a lot on our age, on genetics, all sorts of things that might not really be modifiable. So what matters there is really to try to capture these changes with respect to ourselves, and that will allow us to see when there is more stress and make adjustments accordingly.
Many people, when I talk to them about HRV, they'll say, I have high interoception. I understand what's going on. I don't need a gizmo to tell me if I'm stressed or not. I can feel it. That's the first thing people say. And the second thing people say is, so what if I am? What am I going to do about it? And so how would you respond to those, based on the clinical data and research and things that you've done? What do you think about those two responses?
So, well, for the first one, for sure, it's not that the same tools need to apply to everyone. So for me, that's perfectly normal. Sometimes, though, even when working with, for example, professional athletes, right, they are definitely in tune with their body, right? They understand very well what is happening, how they respond to training is their job. And at the same time, though, what they say is that, I don't use it to guide me particularly, but as something that, can be an objective confirmation of what I'm feeling and how things are going when everything is going well. And at the same time, there can be all sorts of stressors in life that, you don't foresee coming. I think just about the situation we are in right now with the global pandemic. So there are things that happen. And even talking to coaches of these athletes, they say, we sometimes, you just see maybe scores trending down a couple of days, and then it's just a tool that you use to start a conversation with the athlete, right? It doesn't replace how you subjectively feel, or your decision making is not entirely based on that. But the fact that, you notice, again, it's awareness that there is some more stress, something might be trending negatively, and then you use that just to start a conversation and, work on that. So I think it can be helpful, even if you are really in tune with your body and already, reasonably aware of things.
Yeah, my experience has been that the people who claim to know the most what's going on in their body tend to know the least. It's like it's like the typical thing, the person who claims they know everything usually knows nothing. But by the time you figure out what's going on, you realize we hardly know anything. But it's really hard to know. Also, people respond differently to stress. Some people really get fueled by it emotionally, so they might be in an emotionally very positive, very motivated place to train or to work hard or to stay up late and pull the all-nighter or whatever it is. But that can just be stress hormones. It can just be, and they're just fueled by the moment. And some people really feed off that. But that's still, the fact that you feel good doesn't necessarily mean that you are good. And you could be putting yourself in a position where you're susceptible to, catching a virus or to, hurting your knee or whatever it is. And I just think any way you can layer on self-awareness is always a positive thing, and I've never had somebody go through HRV training with me where they didn't at least learn something. Number one, about where they are, but I think even more interesting is how they can potentially increase their HRV. They can boost their HRV. Can you talk about some simple techniques that people use commonly?
Yeah, so there's complex, I would say. So in general, if you have a healthy lifestyle and, you take care of yourself and of your sleep and, we work, again, much with athletes and, all of those boxes normally are checked, which means that you don't necessarily expect HRV to change over time much, right? Depending on where you're at, if you're already at that stage, then it's really a tool that you use for continuous feedback. So, it captures stress on a day-to-day basis. You make changes so that, your stress stays in what we would call, an optimal zone for health and performance. Then if your lifestyle is not as good, then, of course, you could try to make some changes also to improve what is your baseline HRV. And again, healthy lifestyle, activity is just, the usual factors are certainly the most important. Plus, there is a lot of research, again, that loops back into HRV because it's methods directly targeting basically training of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is basically what we do with deep breathing and, exercise linked to biofeedback. And that could be a technique. Let's say it's more difficult to evaluate the effect, but it does make sense that, while you do that, it's like, when you do your training for any other sport, in this case, you do training for your parasympathetic nervous system and you try to stimulate it and you want to try to see if that brings us a longer term effect.
For people listening who, they have a phone and they're curious about this, how would you suggest they get started? Like, should they commit, just so we can give them something manageable? It's not, measure your heart rate variability every day for the rest of your life. Should we put them on a 10-day regime, a 30-day regime? What do you think is a reasonable period of time for somebody who wants to experiment with this technology, gain a little bit of that interoception, gain a little bit of understanding about how things are affecting them, and hopefully make some positive changes going forward?
Yeah. So I would say, start with the simplest method. Get the app that allows you to measure first thing in the morning, just using your phone, and do that a few days. And then you will start seeing, what's day-to-day change in your HRV when there is more or less stress. You will start to be able to relate that to other things you're doing stresses in your life, poor night of sleep, anything that can have an impact. And normally we say 3 to 5 measurements per week are sufficient to get an understanding of how things are trending. Sometimes it's just easier to make it a habit, and you wake up and do it every day. And often it's just it could be that people do it for a few weeks and then figure out what are the factors that have a larger influence and learn something about themselves and how to manage things without maybe the need for using the technology all the time. Others then rely more on it or continue to use it because, again, the stressors change over time, right? It's never the same. And at the same time, not only we are exposed to different forms of stress, but also our way to manage the same stressors changes because we might adapt or learn how to handle them. So everything, linked to stress is very dynamic. And that's why I think it's useful to get, these data points that helps us have a little more awareness around stress and our response to stressors, because again, everything changes continuously, and we can always try to make a little smarter changes and adapt a bit better.
And if you get an athlete and their HRV score is poor, and they have a training day coming up, or they have a game or a match or a meet or whatever it is, how do you, in the context of an athlete, whether it's an amateur or a professional athlete, how do you suggest they deal with that data? Kind of looping back to my earlier question, I'm stressed out, so what do I do? What are common tools that they're using on that level?
Yeah, so the easiest approach there, which seems to make the most sense, also based on published literature in the past few years, would be during training, if your body is already significantly stressed, you would try to reduce the intensity of what you have scheduled. So if you had a high intensity session, you would scale that down. It doesn't mean that you cannot work out, right? Especially if you are used to do it every day. You just don't do it at that intensity because, of course, again, your body capacity to handle stress is limited. So there is already a lot of stress. The more you put, the more you risk, to have longer recovery and to take more time to get back to normal. And that's, the basic principle behind also all the HRV guided research, which showed even, very good results for training plans that use this approach with respect to standard periodization. Eventually these athletes that did not stress their body too much at the wrong time ended up having performed less total amount of high intensity training, but have improved also performance more after 8 to 12 weeks of this approach. So, the timing matters, right? It's you need to provide the stimulus when your body is ready to absorb it and to adapt.
It's very difficult to have like an A to B connection, but I think, almost everybody listening can relate to the idea that most of the time when you get an injury or an illness, it's often multifactorial, meaning you're working too hard and you slip, or you're working too hard and you pull an all-nighter, and then you wake up with the flu or the fever or the throat infection, whatever it is. And, this idea to try to minimize our susceptibility to injury, illness, all these things is something that I think is top of mind for everybody. And this is a really accessible technology that's getting more and more accessible. Before we wrap up for today, Marco, what are you excited about in terms of going forward? You mentioned the Oura Ring, really cool technology, pretty expensive, 500 euros or whatever. Are you hopeful that this stuff will become built into the standard hardware stack of phones? Do you feel like the phones are already there? What is your hope in terms of wearables and price points and things like that to get this technology into more people's hands?
Yeah, so the phones are great, but you can only do these shorter measurements, right? So if you want to do longer measurements, sometimes you still need a sensor. I think we made great progress. Again, the Oura Ring is a bit pricey, but the form factor is already something quite amazing. I would say, it's very small, the latest version, and it packs great technology. So I think over time, as usual, these things will become cheaper and easier to use. And I think most of the work we need to do is really to make sure, again, that they're used just in the correct way to capture it at the right time. And then, people can derive useful insights from them. And yeah, I would say more or less that's where things slowly are heading. As you said, we talked few years back. It hasn't changed that much, still we are doing our work with the phones, and then, there are a few more devices, but it takes time, yeah.
Marco, thanks so much for coming on the show. I appreciate your work and what you're doing, and I wish you a continued success. Thanks so much. For the first time ever, Yoga Alliance has opened up their bar standard, their 200-hour certification for online-only training. Because of COVID-19, obviously, we can't train in person. And so the 200-hour training, if you don't know, is kind of the gold standard. It's what about 95% of yoga teachers teaching in studios or fitness centers or at home or privately, wherever. It's about what 95% of people use for their teaching credential. And historically needed to spend about 3 weeks in person, which was great. We had people coming from all over the world to Barcelona to train with us. And so when COVID happened, obviously we went online, and we were online only. We always had fusion courses. We were really nervous about the change. Could we do it? Could we actually train people only virtually without hands on toes and these kinds of things? And we're just finishing up our first batch of students. And I have to say, not only has it gone well, in many ways it's gone better than our in-person course. Why? First reason is we have more time, so instead of cramming everything into 3 weeks, we take a full 8 weeks. Second reason is the technology has some real advantages. We can zoom in on students, we do hot seats, we do workshops, we have quite a large training team giving feedback on a daily basis. So you join a live class, you get feedback about your practice, you get up on camera and you teach. It's incredibly interactive, the community is really strong. The short story is I'm really excited about this. It's working great. We have a new batch starting here very, very shortly to learn about our upcoming June course. We've already got a great group of students signed up, and the trainers and I are excited. Go to yogateacherscollege.com and we'll share more details. So if you're thinking about becoming a yoga teacher, if you'd like to make the most of this COVID time, it's a great time to get certified at home. This week's nutritional tip comes in response to a listener question on Instagram. Kelly says, Lucas, I know that onions and garlic are high in sulfur and good for connective tissues, but they make me feel weird and I don't like the smell the next day. Are there any alternatives? So the allium family foods, onion, garlic, leeks, scallions, chives, shallots, all of these kinds of foods are delicious. They smell great and they can disrupt your nervous system. That's why they're often excluded from meditation centers. The one caveat being when they're cooked, they're much, much less potent. And so raw garlic makes almost everybody feel pretty weird. Cooked garlic, much less so. So that's the first caveat. In terms of sulfur-rich foods, I often turn to the cruciferous family. Arugula, bok choy, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, collard greens, radishes, watercress. All of those are really great sources for sulfur. Pretty easy to digest and a lot easier on your morning breath. Alternatively, you can also supplement with methylsulfonylmethane. About a gram a day, Kelly, could be helpful. If you're wondering what the heck we're talking about, sulfur is often dubbed the beauty mineral. It's great for your skin. Almost everything that's great for your skin is also great for the tissues on your inside, your muscles, tendons, cartilage, ligaments, fascia. And for that reason, sulfur is a yoga student's best friend when it comes to minerals. Eating sulfur-rich foods and potentially even supplementing with sulfur can be a really great idea. Hope that's helpful, Kelly. We have a listener question from Gary on Instagram. I thought it was relevant for today's show. And Gary says, hey Lucas, I've been practicing yoga for a couple of years and I'm trying to find a style of yoga where there are more men. Nothing against women, I love women, but sometimes I just feel awkward as the only guy in class. Do you have any recommendations? Gary, I started practicing in 2003, and back then it was in New York City. It was about 80% women, 20% men, and it's gotten a little bit better, even in New York and Santa Monica and things like this, but in the rest of the world, it's about 15% men, and so still totally female dominated. In terms of what to do about it, well, there's a couple of things. The acro yoga community has a whole bunch of guys, so if you're into acro yoga people, there's a whole bunch of guys in acro yoga. That can be a good way to go. If you get into more athletic styles, there tends to be more men, and also if you get into hot yoga, the percentage seems to go up a little bit more. There is men's only yoga. And just to give you a word of warning, in many cases, all men's yoga, there's a little bit of a different vibe going on. You can kind of guess where that's going. And so if that's what you're looking for, that's what you'll find. But it sounds like you're just looking for a class with a little bit more gender balance. And for whatever reason, more hardcore styles like hot yoga or dynamic athletic styles of yoga can be a good way to go. But I would encourage you to check out acro yoga as well. Hope that's helpful. Thanks for listening to The Lucas Rockwood Show. If you enjoy the podcast, I have 2 asks of you. Number 1, share the show on social media with your friends and tag me. My handle is @LucasRockwood. Number 2 is please leave a rating and review in whatever app you're listening on. And last but not least, before you go, if you'd like to be on my mailing list, every week I send out information about the podcast, behind the scenes stuff, announcements of online classes and special events. I email about once a week. You can do that at yogabody.com/sign me up. And right now we have a free breathing worksheet on that page as well. It's yogabody.com/sign me up. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.